September 1940. Nazi Germany's grip on Poland had turned the nation into a shadow of its former self. Cities burned, families disappeared, and rumors spread of a new camp in the town of Auschwitz. Few knew what it truly was. Fewer still dared to find out. But one man volunteered to. His name was Witold Pilecki, a 39-year-old Polish cavalry officer, husband, and father of two. When others in the resistance whispered about the horrors surrounding Auschwitz, Pilecki didn't hesitate. He suggested something unthinkable: to get himself arrested and sent inside. His goal? To uncover the truth and build a resistance network within the camp itself. At the time, even the Polish underground had only fragments of information about what was happening behind the barbed wire. People were vanishing into the camp system, never to return. The Germans claimed it was just a detention center, but Pilecki suspected otherwise. He knew the mission was likely suicidal. He would enter under a false identity, Tomasz Serafiński, and report on everything he saw. On September 19, 1940, during a German street raid in Warsaw, he deliberately allowed himself to be captured. As others screamed and fought to escape, he stood still, calm and ready. They shoved him into a truck filled with terrified prisoners. The road to Auschwitz was a descent into the unknown. Soldiers yelling, dogs barking, gunfire cracking in the distance. By nightfall, Pilecki found himself behind barbed wire, surrounded by watchtowers and the stench of burning flesh. It was the beginning of a mission unlike any in human history, a man walking voluntarily into the heart of the Holocaust, armed only with courage, faith, and a purpose the world would one day remember. He had become prisoner number 4,859. Inside Auschwitz, he wasn't a soldier anymore. He was just another nameless figure in striped rags. But in his mind, a secret war had begun. When Witold Pilecki stepped through the gates of Auschwitz, he entered a world that defied comprehension. The camp was still in its early phase, but the brutality was already absolute. Prisoners were beaten to death for falling out of line. Starvation, disease, and random executions were part of the routine. Men collapsed under labor until their bodies gave out. Pilecki quickly realized he could not survive alone. The only way to fight back was to organize quietly, carefully, under the guards' noses. Within weeks, he began building the foundation of what would become one of the first underground resistance networks inside a Nazi concentration camp. Using his military discipline and calm composure, Pilecki made contact with other Polish officers, priests, and educated men imprisoned with him. He formed a secret cell called Związek Organizacji Wojskowej, the Military Organization Union, or ZOO. The group's goal was simple, but almost impossible: to maintain morale, provide aid, gather intelligence, and prepare for an uprising. Every day, under the constant threat of death, they worked to recruit trustworthy prisoners. They passed coded messages, smuggled food, and shared news of the outside world to keep hope alive. When someone was too weak to work, ZOO members risked punishment to hide them or share a scrap of bread. In a place designed to crush the human spirit, these acts of quiet defiance became small flames of resistance. Pilecki memorized details: names of guards, layout of barracks, the number of arriving trains, the conditions of prisoners. His intelligence reports were among the first eyewitness accounts of Auschwitz's true purpose. Through smuggled notes and contacts in the Polish underground, he sent word to Warsaw that the camp was not just a prison, it was a factory of death. By 1941, he estimated that thousands of Jews, Poles, and Soviet POWs were being systematically murdered. The camp's operations grew deadlier by the month. Gas chambers were under construction. The crematoria burned day and night. Despite the unbearable environment, Pilecki's underground continued to expand. He created units in various work details, ensuring that if one group was discovered, the others could still function. Some members managed to steal German documents or uniforms. Others tapped into food store rooms to save fellow inmates from starvation. But betrayal was a constant threat. The Gestapo's informants were everywhere. One whisper could end dozens of lives. Pilecki himself was interrogated several times, but managed to maintain his cover. To the guards, he was just another number. Prisoner 4859, assigned to manual labor. Weak, but obedient. Inside, however, he was coordinating one of the most daring resistance operations ever attempted behind enemy lines. Over the next 2 years, the underground sent out multiple reports detailing Auschwitz's horrors. Pilecki expected Allied bombers or a Polish raid to liberate the camp. None came. His pleas went unanswered. The world, it seemed, refused to believe that such evil could exist on such a scale. By 1943, after nearly 3 years of imprisonment, the camp's conditions became unbearable. The executions multiplied, and the underground's communication lines grew fragile. Pilecki made a fateful decision. He would escape. Not to save himself, but to personally deliver his report and convince the resistance and allies to act. The mission had begun as an act of sacrifice. Now it would become a desperate race to expose the truth before it was too late. By early 1943, Auschwitz had become a landscape of endless death. The air carried the smell of burning flesh. Prisoners were reduced to numbers, stripped of identity, faith, and hope. Witold Pilecki had endured nearly 3 years inside, documenting every atrocity, building his underground network, and sending reports that traveled through secret channels to Warsaw. But nothing changed. The Allies had not acted. The world still didn't understand what was happening behind the fences. Pilecki realized that staying inside any longer would mean death and silence. The only way to make the world believe was to escape and tell it himself. Escape from Auschwitz was almost impossible. The camp was surrounded by double barbed wire fences carrying lethal current. Watchtowers stood every few meters, manned by guards with rifles and searchlights. Beyond the fences, dogs patrolled the perimeter, and the surrounding land was an open killing zone. Anyone caught was executed instantly. But Pilecki was not an ordinary prisoner. Over years of careful planning, his underground had mapped guard shifts, weak points in the fences, and storage sheds with materials they could use. He had earned a position in a bakery outside the main fence, a rare opportunity that allowed him and 2 trusted companions, Edward Ciesielski and Jan Redzej, to move slightly beyond the inner camp boundaries. On the night of April 26, 1943, they made their move. As a thunderstorm rolled in, masking their footsteps, they cut through the wire using stolen tools. The rain pounded the ground, muffling the sound of snapping metal. When the last strand broke, they crawled through mud and darkness, every second expecting to be shot. They crossed open ground, waded through icy streams, and ran until their legs nearly gave out. Behind them, the camp sirens wailed. The alarm had been raised. Searchlights swept the fields. Gunfire cracked through the night. But the storm and chaos favored them. For 2 days, they moved through the forest, surviving on raw grain and stolen food, hiding during daylight, and traveling by night. Finally, after nearly 100 kilometers on foot, they reached a farmhouse near the town of Nowy Wiżnich. local members of the Polish resistance took them in, providing clothes and shelter. For the first time in nearly 3 years, Pilecki was free. But freedom was not his goal. He immediately wrote detailed reports about what he had seen inside Auschwitz: the starvation, executions, gas chambers, and crematoria. His document, known as the Pilecki Report, was one of the first eyewitness accounts of the Holocaust ever written. He described how the Germans were systematically exterminating Jews, Poles, and Soviet prisoners by the thousands. He named the officers, described the methods, and estimated the daily death toll. He sent the report through the Polish resistance to London and the Allied command. Yet, when it arrived, it was met with disbelief. British and American officials found it too horrific to be true. Some dismissed it as exaggerated propaganda. Pilecki's words, written at the cost of unimaginable suffering, were ignored. Meanwhile, inside Auschwitz, his underground network was destroyed by Gestapo crackdowns. Dozens of brave men he had worked with were executed. The world's silence weighed heavily on him, but Pilecki did not stop. He rejoined the Polish Home Army and fought again in the underground war against the Nazis. In 1944, during the Warsaw Uprising, he took up arms once more, leading men in street battles, determined to liberate his city from German occupation. The man who had entered Auschwitz voluntarily now fought freely on Polish soil. But the struggle for freedom was far from over. Because when the war ended, another shadow fell over Poland, and Pilecki would soon find himself facing an enemy even more dangerous than before. When Nazi Germany finally fell in 1945, much of Europe celebrated liberation. But for Poland, the end of one tyranny became the beginning of another. The Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, moved in to take control. The Red Army swept across the country, and communist authorities began arresting members of the Polish resistance, the very people who had risked everything to fight the Nazis. For Witold Pilecki, the nightmare was not over. After escaping Auschwitz, after surviving years of occupation and fighting in the Warsaw Uprising, he had expected a free homeland. Instead, Poland was now under Soviet control, its government in exile dismissed, its heroes hunted like criminals. In 1945, Pilecki continued working quietly for the Polish Home Army, now forced underground once again. He gathered intelligence on the new communist regime, documenting arrests, executions, and the growing system of Soviet terror that replaced the Gestapo with the NKVD. The same courage that had driven him into Auschwitz now drove him to expose the new oppressors. But the Soviets were watching. In May 1947, the secret police, the Urzędbezpieczeństwa, or UB, arrested him in Warsaw. He was taken to Mokotów prison, a place infamous for torture and forced confessions. The man who had walked into Auschwitz voluntarily now found himself chained by his own government. For months, he was beaten, starved, and interrogated. Guards broke his ribs, knocked out his teeth, and kept him awake for days. Yet, he refused to betray his comrades or the resistance networks still active in Poland. Witnesses later said he remained calm, proud, and unbroken. Even his torturers admitted they had never met a man so composed under pain. At his show trial in 1948, the Communist Court accused him of espionage for foreign powers, meaning the West. The charges were fabricated, the outcome predetermined. In reality, his only crime was refusing to surrender Poland's independence. The courtroom was filled with propaganda and lies, and his defense was silenced. Pilecki stood before the judges, pale but unbowed. He told them, "I tried to live my life in such a way that in the hour of my death I would feel joy rather than fear." On May 25, 1948, the verdict was carried out. Witold Pilecki was executed with a bullet to the back of the head, a method borrowed from the Soviets, in the basement of Mokotov prison. His body was dumped in an unmarked grave, his name erased from public memory. The regime labeled him a traitor, his reports buried, his heroism silenced for decades. His wife, Maria, was never told where he was buried. His children grew up under the shadow of fear, forbidden to speak his name. The man who had volunteered for Auschwitz, who fought both Nazi and Soviet tyranny, was written out of Polish history, condemned by the very government he had hoped to protect. But even in death, the truth refused to die. His friends and surviving comrades secretly preserved his writings, passing them down in whispers through the years. And long after communism fell, his story would resurface, a testimony of loyalty, bravery, and the tragic fate of a man who loved his country more than his own life. For nearly half a century, the name Witold Pilecki was erased from Poland's history. The communist regime that executed him worked tirelessly to ensure no one would ever know what he did, or what he sacrificed. His reports were locked away. His military service was deleted from records. His story existed only in secret whispers among surviving resistance members and exiled Poles who remembered the man who had volunteered for Auschwitz. But truth has a way of resurfacing. After the fall of communism in 1989, historians began uncovering long-suppressed documents from wartime archives. Among them were the Pilecki reports, detailed typewritten pages describing life inside Auschwitz from the perspective of a man who had lived it willingly. The reports were horrifying, meticulous, and undeniable. They confirmed what Allied leaders had once refused to believe: that Pilecki had been among the first to expose the full scale of the Holocaust. When these documents became public, the world was stunned. How could such a man, one who risked everything to reveal the truth, have been executed by his own post-war government? How had history forgotten him? The rediscovery of Pilecki's story transformed him from an erased patriot into one of the greatest heroes of World War II. He became a symbol not only of Polish courage, but of moral clarity. A man who stood against evil in all its forms, Nazi or Soviet, regardless of the cost. His former comrades spoke out. Survivors of Auschwitz testified to his leadership and humanity inside the camp. His children, long silenced by fear, finally told the world who their father truly was, a man who chose hell to protect others from it. In 1990, Witold Pilecki was officially rehabilitated by the Polish state. His conviction was annulled, his rank restored, and his honor reclaimed. Monuments, museums, and military memorials were erected in his name. Streets and schools across Poland now bear the number 4859, his prisoner number at Auschwitz, as a permanent reminder of what he endured. Today, his story is studied by soldiers, historians, and freedom fighters around the world. The courage of a man who volunteered for Auschwitz, who escaped to tell the truth, and who faced death again rather than betray his principles, remains one of the most extraordinary acts of heroism in human history. Witold Pilecki never sought glory. He sought truth. He believed that duty to others stood above personal survival, that the measure of a man was how far he would go for what is right. His final act of defiance was silence in the face of torture, choosing death over dishonor. In the words of one historian, he told the truth too early, and the world wasn't ready to hear it. But today, his story stands immortal. He was not just a soldier, he was not just a spy, He was a man who walked into hell so others would one day know what it looked like, and dared to come back out to tell the world. If you were moved by this story, like, share, and subscribe to WWII Heroes Legends, where true stories of courage never die. Turn on the bell so you never miss the next untold story of bravery, sacrifice, and the men who defied history itself.